Mr. Grozev, welcome to Stockholm and Fredagsintervjun, the Friday interview.
Thanks for having me on this famous podcast.
I just stated you live under serious threat. How would you describe your situation?
I found out that I was under actual threat about 2 years ago actually, in fact, in the beginning of 23. Before that, I knew that, of course, I'm of interest to Russian intelligence services. They had put me on a wanted list, but that they were planning actual kidnapping or assassination, I only found out in the beginning of 23. And since then, my life has been almost like life on the run. I'm not living at home, not living with my family. I used to live in Austria. They stayed in Austria, and I've been living on the American continent, so to say, more vaguely. And recently there was a court case in the United Kingdom where they convicted and sentenced 6 of the spies that were after me. But of course, I'm aware that that's only one group and they'll be replaced with others. So it's going to be like that for a while.
Yeah. Do you know how long?
Until Putin is out of power, and then some.
So I was about to ask you how this is affecting your lives, but it has turned it more or less upside down.
Overnight, I found out that I cannot go home and that for the foreseeable future, I will not be able to go home. And initially, it's a feeling of disorientation, of homelessness. And then over time, you kind of normalize that and you begin living with a temporary home until something changes again. And something did change again 6 months ago when the administration in the United States changed, because again, I have to reconsider what is the best place for my new temporary home.
And traveling to Europe, traveling to Stockholm as you do now, is that also combined with certain risks?
Yes, it is.
How so?
Every location within Schengen is risky. I've been investigating Russian intelligence operations, including offensive operations, assassinations, for more than 10 years. And I know that once they're able to penetrate the weakest link into the Schengen area, they can travel without leaving a trace to other places. And knowing that I'm on their list, obviously, a place like Stockholm would be easy for them to get to, even by car, not necessarily by plane. So unfortunately, I have to take precautions even when I come to a peaceful, safe country like Sweden.
Mm. You are said to be on Putin's kill list. What is known about that list?
What is known is that it's pretty big and it's approved by Putin. And the reason why it's approved by Putin is because no intelligence agency will take the risk to go after somebody, especially a foreigner, without having the okay by Putin, because that would be suicidal for them. The person who would pay the political reputation price is Putin. Everybody will be blaming Putin. So he has to be comfortable with that. And what is known from various sources, most cinematically from the Telegram chats that were made part of a court case in the UK, is that at least somebody senior in the hierarchy of the FSB reported that Putin personally hates him, so we need to take care of him.
So it's a kind of a personal list for Putin. People he can't stand, that has, in his eyes, humiliated him, or likewise?
Let's say it's a list of people that he has approved. Whether it's always personal, we don't know, because in many cases the people are added to the list based on an assessment of risk by intelligence agencies, but he has to approve the addition of that person to the list. In my particular case, by tracing the beginning of this surge, the escalation of the risk to me, it all points to one day, which is the day of our publication of the Navalny poisoning investigation, which was on the 14th of December 2020. And that was the day of huge embarrassment for Putin, of humiliation for Putin, because we not only showed that the Russian FSB, the domestic security service, poisoned Navalny with Novichok and had tried to do that in previous occasions, but we also humiliated the service by tricking one of the members of the team who poisoned Navalny to confess to everything.
On record.
On the record.
Yeah.
On
we're gonna discuss that later on as well, that investigation. But first, this week, a number of people were convicted in the UK for being part of a Bulgarian spy ring who, on behalf of Russia, FSB, monitored you, mapped you, and discussed to also kidnap or perhaps even kill you. And the leader was sentenced to, I think, 11 years in prison, and the rest will serve prison time as well.
Between 7 and 9 years, the rest, yeah.
How have you been following these court hearings? Have you learned something new?
Oh, yes. The British investigators did not share with me most of the evidence because they wanted to keep it to be presented in court for the first time, and I was supposed to be a uninformed witness/victim just for the purity of the process. I was extremely curious, of course, to find out what they had, but often my colleagues from Britain were able to find out details before I could about the case that involved me, which was a bit surreal. Usually I'm the one who gets the data first, but in this case, I complied with the request of the British investigators. Do not investigate yourself, please.
You're part of the trial.
Yes, I'm part of the procedure. So you can imagine as a journalist how difficult it is to sit on your hands and not investigate something, especially when it relates to me and my family. But I did that. In the course of the proceedings, I could see through reporting by journalists the wealth of data, of evidence that existed. We're talking about more than 200,000 chat messages that were obtained by the prosecutors on the Telegram app, which were chats between the person sitting in Moscow and the people in London, from where they were launched on several operations across Europe to surveil me, my family, and my colleagues. I found out, of course, a lot about how they operate. I found out that it's a personal vendetta by Putin. And I found out, very importantly, when it started. And it started again on that day of the publication of the Navalny investigation. Previously, I suspected that would have been the most personally embarrassing one for Putin, but now we know for sure.
Now you know.
Yeah.
They were partly, sometimes this Bulgarian spy ring is described as kind of amateurs. But what is your view on how they operated, and is it typical for the FSB and the Russian intelligence?
Oh, no, it is not typical. It's a new phenomenon that only appeared several years ago. Phenomenon of outsourcing violence and preparation for violence to non-professional spies. And this was caused by the lack of people, professional spies, they can send to Europe. And this is the result of many journalistic investigations, including ours at Bellingcat at the time, which disclosed hundreds and maybe thousands of names of spies who could no longer travel under fake identity. Also, Western countries kicked out a lot of Russian spies under diplomatic cover. So Russia suddenly found itself missing capabilities in Europe and in the world. And they had to find an alternative. One of the alternatives was such non-professional spies.
So that's why one of these persons, for example, they were running a beauty parlor in the UK.
Yeah, that was the woman who was supposed to honey trap me.
Yeah.
Another one was a driver of an ambulance. A third one was a medical lab assistant. And like in a Ocean 11 movie, of course, there was a wrestler and so on and so forth. So it was a motley crew of non-professionals who were trained to use sophisticated spying equipment, to use spy glasses, to look out for counter-surveillance, and yes, and ultimately they were arrested. But it doesn't make them less dangerous. In some ways, it makes them more dangerous than professional spies because they are not trained to avoid collateral damage. They are not trained to de-escalate. And in one particular case, this non-professionalism came very close to being extremely dangerous for my family, which is when in 2022, in the summer of 22, they broke into my apartment in Vienna. And the goal was to steal the laptop that could be seen in the film Navalny, the laptop I had used for the Navalny investigation. Apparently, it was very important for them to get that one. They thought there were some really big secrets there. They waited for me and my daughter to go out for lunch on that day and assumed that there was nobody at home. They broke into the apartment using a professional key, a locksmith who helped them. Mm-hmm. They stole the wrong laptop, but my son was in his room during the whole break-in. And thank God that he was playing a computer game with headphones and he didn't hear them come in, because otherwise he would have walked out of the room, he would have confronted them, and then God knows what would have happened.
Might have turned dangerous
exactly.
for him.
But this is an example of how we make fun of them being bumbling idiots, but that can be very dangerous, even more dangerous than when using professional spies.
It also emerged that for a time they were monitoring your father, who died under, as I understand it, somewhat unclear circumstances, just about when this all happened. Could they have targeted him, or you don't really know?
I don't know, and I preferred not to think about that possibility. In terms of timing, they were arrested 3 days after his sudden death. The death was very sudden. He was very healthy and upbeat and looking forward to the Oscar ceremony for Navalny, and then suddenly he disappeared. We couldn't reach him, and then he died. Later, the investigators from the United Kingdom showed me photographs of the spy group taking photos of my father's apartment, and even putting an arrow to his balcony saying entrance from here. And of course, this made me think one more time, could they have used this to lure me back to come back to Austria? Because by then I had stayed in the United States and they had no way to get to me. And that's one possibility. I don't think I will ever know what really happened.
What is it to live under this kind of constant stress that this must pose on you?
Well, as I said in the beginning, it's really, really hard. You feel disoriented, displaced. It's almost like an out-of-body experience. And then you just normalize it, and the stress remains really at a certain very high level, but you get used to it.
Do you manage to sleep, to eat, to work out, to read books? I don't know.
Read books, not much. I am also writing a book, so that takes some of my free time. But I mostly relax by investigating, because that's something that gives me a concrete result. If I find a new spy every day, then that gives me a level of comfort that allows me to sleep. If I don't, then it's hard to sleep.
So one spy a day is like
That's the minimum.
Okay. How often do you see your wife, your children, your family?
I've missed so many of the important sort of landmarks. I've missed my daughter's 18th birthday. I will miss her graduation ceremony because I cannot attend it. I see them once every 3 months. And in the summertime, the children come and join me wherever I am. And that's great time for being with them. But otherwise, I'm trying not to bring the danger to them.
So that must be a hard, you want to see them, but still that could pose a threat.
Yes. Again, I'm trying to see them as much as I can without making them a target.
Alexei Navalny, the former opposition leader in Russia, he called you the Sherlock Holmes of journalism. After he was poisoned by Russian agents, you managed to track them down, as you earlier mentioned, and find out their real identities. How did you manage to do that?
In that particular case, we had the advantage of having discovered one company in Russia that was central to the chemical weapons manufacturing, hidden chemical weapons manufacturing program. And I had been able to get phone records of the top management of that company called the Signal Center. And what I started doing after Nobody could find out what really happened to Alexei Navalny. We knew the time of his poisoning, approximately just before he fell into a coma. And I looked at the call records of people in that institute, and I saw a surge of calls early that morning at 6 in the morning on the day that he ultimately fell ill. And one hypothesis was that they may have been involved because they're the only entity in Russia that deals with Novichok research and development. And by following whom they called, I discovered that they called people from a secretive unit of the FSB called the Criminalistics Institute. And then by looking at the travel records of the people who had been speaking to the institute, I found that they had been traveling not only exactly then when Navalny was going to Tomsk and then to was in Siberia, but also they had tailed him for years before that. And that was an aha moment when I knew, okay, this cannot be a coincidence. Ultimately, I was able to obtain the phone records, the metadata of the phone records of these people from the Criminalistics Institute. And I saw that one of them had switched his phone on for a second, and we geolocated the phone next to the hotel where Navalny was just before falling into a coma.
So kind of a puzzle.
Yes.
And where do you find these phone records and databases? I mean, most people, including me, you look upon Russia as a fairly closed society, a control apparatus in some way.
Well, it's both very closed and very transparent, and it's a function of a society like that having two important qualities. One is that they love gathering data about every citizen, and they centralize that data. They put it in central databases for the FSB to be able to look up everything. And the second quality is corruption. There is so much corruption up the food chain, starting from underpaid police officers in a little town who have access to the central system, to people, underpaid people in telecoms companies who are willing to sell data about their clients on a sort of a brokerage of the dark web. Not really technically the dark web, but Telegram channels where people know that they can go and order such records. Usually, criminals order such data. But since 10 years ago, journalists also started doing that because that's the only way to investigate a society where there's no real law enforcement and there's no cooperation with other law enforcements of other countries.
So there's a lot of information gathered and also a lot of corruption and corrupt people in the system. They sell it to whoever wants to buy it, and it ends up online as well then.
That is correct. And some of it is already leaked, so you don't have to buy it. Because especially after the war started, there's a lot of disgruntled people, young people working in IT in Russia, in government institutions. And many of them already leaked huge databases, such as the border crossing data for the last 10 years of Russia. So in many cases, you don't need to buy data because it's already out there.
So it's in one way like a paradox. It's easier to get hold of data from inside Russia and what people are doing, who they call, how they travel, than in, for example, Sweden, that is normally regarded as a fairly open society.
As my colleague from the Insider, Roman Dobrokhotov, often says, sarcastically, Russia is the most transparent society. But then again, life balances itself out because in Sweden you have law enforcement who can get that data and you can trust their intentions. In Russia, they can get the data and they do get the data, but we know that they will never prosecute themselves or investigate themselves because they are the criminals.
Talking about Alexei Navalny, an epic scene in a well-known documentary about Navalny, which you have also mentioned, in which you also take part, is where when Navalny calls one of the Russian agents, and he's pretending, I think, to be an FSB investigator. And the agent just tell him the whole story about the poisoning attempt, how they tried to do it and what went wrong. It's almost surreal to watch it. How was it for you to sit just beside Navalny when he was having this phone conversation?
Surreal is the right word, especially consider that we hadn't slept that night because we had been preparing the publication of the whole investigation until about 4 in the morning. Then we took a nap of half an hour and we needed to be ready to start calling at 6 in the morning.
And who came up with the idea? Why don't you, Navalny, call your poisoner?
The idea was different in the beginning. My idea was usually before a publication, we call and give a right of response to the subject of the investigation. So we were obligated to call these people anyway. And we decided, why don't we have Alexei Navalny call them and give them a right of response? In a way, say, I am Alexei Navalny, why did you try to poison me? And we started with that approach, and it didn't work out because all of them were hanging up the phone. And at one point, he himself said, can we switch into a prank? Can I pretend to be somebody up the food chain in the FSB and see whether I get some response this way? So I thought, for a second, I said, well, I'm not sure about the ethics and it will never work, but give it a try. So I gave him the name of an actual officer from the FSB that we had investigated. We were able to spoof the phone number, the caller ID of that person, put it into an app, and Alexei called on behalf of a boss.
And asked, what went wrong here? Actually, I'm investigating the whole poisoning attempt.
Yeah, he said, like, I'm writing a report for my boss, Patrushev, and he's like the scariest top-level boss of the FSB and the whole intelligence apparatus. So people don't fuck with him. So he said, I'm his assistant, and he wants this morning a report on what the hell went wrong. And initially the guy was like, well, I cannot speak on an open line. And then Alexei said, well, I allow you to speak on an open line. And the guy accepted that, and he spoke for 53 minutes.
Do you know what happened with this guy who he was tricked by Navalny and by you in some way? Do you know what happened to him later on?
Yeah, we were very concerned about him. Actually, that same evening, we tried to call him back, and